Hey, this is Mrs. Reichelt, and we're moving on into the central nervous system. So everything else we've really talked about has to do with just in general talk about the nervous system. Now we're moving into the central nervous system. So specifically, we'll be going through the brain and the spinal cord. Although we're going to spend most of our time on the brain, we're not going to really spend that much time on the spinal cord. Okay, so we're starting off with number 9 in your study guide. So the central nervous system develops from an embryonic neural tube. That tube ultimately becomes the spinal cord and also the brain. You also have some openings in the brain that become ventricles. Ventricles are open spaces that are fluid filled. So maybe I should write that. Fluid filled chambers or spaces. So there's 4 chambers or spaces in the brain. They are 1 and 2. 1 and 2 are called lateral ventricles. So there are 2 lateral ventricles. There's one that's called the third ventricle and one that's the fourth ventricle. And you'll see these as we look at models of the brain and as we go through and color a little bit later. Okay, so now we're in part 10, which goes through the regions of the brain. So there are 4 major regions of the brain. We have the cerebral hemisphere, which is also known as the cerebrum. We have the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The cerebral hemisphere, by the way, we're now in part 11. So the cerebral hemisphere is a paired region, okay? We have a left side and we have a right side. The cerebrum makes up over half of the brain's mass, and the surfaces are made of gyrus and sulci. The gyri are the outer parts that kind of look like this. They kind of look like hills, or then the sulci are the grooves. Okay, the sulci are kind of the cavities in between each of those. Okay, then we have fissures. Fissures are the really deep grooves that divide the cerebrum into different lobes. So you may want to pause this. I put on a picture of what the diagram, what the coloring should look like. These are all the things that you have to color, and I don't care what colors you color any of them, as long as you label them. So for example, the frontal lobe I colored green, so I'm going to make sure that I color this green so I know that that's the frontal lobe. Also, another thing that I did that it's optional for you is I went through and everything that was all of the little areas within the frontal lobe, I actually went through and labeled them different shades of green, so I knew that it was all part of the frontal lobe. Same thing for the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So it's up to you, whatever you want to do. Okay, so now for each section, the frontal lobe deals with motor skills. Okay, the parietal lobe deals with sense receptors, and the temporal lobe deals with auditory, so hearing, and then the occipital lobe deals with visual information. So a little bit more detail for each one of those here. The frontal lobe is our primary motor area, and it sends impulses to skeletal muscles. The parietal lobe receives information from those sensory receptors, such as pain, temperature, touch, pressure, all of those kinds of things. Then we have Broca's area. Broca's area deals with speech, and it's only on the left side. Okay, and you'll be able to see that on the coloring diagram too. It's a little spot that's labeled Broca's area, and it even says it's the area of speech. Okay, so the next thing that I gave you is some more things to color. Now you can color each one that's labeled in a number 1 color, except for the gyrus and the sulcus. Make sure you color those the same as the last picture that you colored, and we're on the next page of our study guide. So make sure you color those, and I think that I included Oh, I don't know. I don't think I included a picture here. Um, so the cerebral areas are also involved in special senses. So your special senses are things like gustatory or taste, visual, auditory, and olfactory or smell. So your cerebrum deals with special senses in addition to all the other things that we talked about, like your motor skills and that sort of thing. The major interpretation area is that speech and language deals with the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital lobe. Primary language comprehension occurs in the frontal lobe, and general information is interpreted in all of those lobes. And then the layers of the cerebrum, we have gray matter, which is the outer layer in the cerebral cortex, and it's composed of neuron bodies. We have white matter, and white matter contains fiber tracts that are deep to the gray matter. So that means that sort of like you would have gray matter here, and then white matter would be the layer deep to that. We also have something called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is what communicates between the two hemispheres, and as you draw your picture, you'll see you have each of the hemispheres, and then you'll have something that kind of connects them, and it looks like a fiber almost kind of thing, and that's the corpus callosum. And then last up, we have our basal nuclei, and this is a gray matter that's buried within the white matter. So if this was gray, and then this thicker red line is white, then the basal nuclei would be the last layer. Okay, so that wraps up all the regions of the brain and specifically goes through the cerebrum.